Welcome everyone to the second of this week's environmental fundraising webinars. I'm sure many of you were here for part one, which was an overview of the different types of fundraising that there are out there and what that menu is. Today, Andrew is going to take us through more of the practicalities about how we start fundraising. First, let me just, I always begin with the preview of upcoming attractions. So here is our packed program of webinars from September to December. Lots of different topics under the Net Zero Carbon series on schools and heat pumps, on the pitfalls you might want to try and avoid, on the faculty process, and on embodied carbon in our building projects. Our 3 Eco Church webinars that we're running for a second time with Arosha, the charity that runs Eco Church, on how to get started, how to work toward an award, and the link between Eco Church and Net Zero. And then our Season of Creation series, Forest Church, the theology of climate change, let all creation sing, and climate action is mission. Hopefully you'll spot something there that catches the eye. I'll put the link in the chat when I've finished to tell you how to book on. Housekeeping for today, we'll be using the Q&A again for questions rather than the chat, so please do move your mouse around, find the Q&A. That's where to put in your questions and put a thumbs up next to the ones that you're most interested in. Those are the ones that will rise to the top, and that's where Andrew and I will focus the time when we're looking at questions. After this afternoon and after today's webinar, I'll be sending around an email with the slides from both of the topics, and with a link through so that you can give us feedback. And if I have them ready, it takes a little while, but if I have them ready, I'll send you the video recording links as well. And those video recordings will also go up on our website. Just a reminder that today's webinar is an hour and a half long. It's a little bit longer than most of ours. I understand you might need to drop out after an hour if this is your precious lunch break, but please stay with us as long as you are able to. Most importantly is to introduce Andrew. If you weren't here on Tuesday, so Andrew is a senior consultant with Philanthropy company. He is a very experienced fundraising director and a consultant. He has secured large 7-figure donations from individual donors, from grant makers in lots of areas, including churches, arts and heritage. And within that has included environmental projects such as LED lighting and insulation when re-roofing. He's also very personally committed to the church and to the environmental agenda, including working with his own church to get a Gold Eco Church Award. Let me stop talking and stop sharing my slides and hand over to you, Andrew, to share your slides and take us away.
That's great. Thank you so much, Catherine. Well, it was lovely to be with you, many of you, on Tuesday for part one of this, and a couple of you really kind and sort of reached out afterwards on things like LinkedIn, and that was great to hear from you, and I'm glad to those that found it helpful. So yeah, if anybody else has sort of further questions after this that you want to direct specifically to me, then you can find me very easily on things like LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter and all those kind of social media stuff. Let me share my screen with you. Share screen, click, and click that one. Hooray. So yeah, thanks for the introduction, Catherine. I used to work, my last proper job before I became a consultant was at National Museums Liverpool. Many of you will have visited the Maritime Museum or the Walker Art Gallery, the Museum of Liverpool. So I helped run the fundraising there with a really great team. But I've also worked a lot with churches. So I've been a church planter and pastor myself for about 10 years in Liverpool and a bunch of churches around there. And I'm a member of the PCC at my own church, and Busman's Holiday also inevitably chaired the funding group for my own church. And we had a meeting last night where we were discussing a bunch of funding related issues to do with giving and gift days and grants and all those sorts of things that I know lots of you are also busy with in your own churches. So I sympathise with some of the challenges that you face on a day-to-day basis. I work with a philanthropy company. We have a whole big variety of clients, including some great ones in the last year. So we've worked with the Captain Tom Foundation. That was a particularly exciting job for us, and lots of other big household name charities that you'll recognise there. You'll see perhaps particular sort of bias towards sort of cultural and arts charities, but lots of others as well. But we also work a lot with lots of small charities, even down to with individual churches and parishes to do building project fundraising, some of those sorts of things. I won't say any more about that because that's also in the previous webinar. So if you want to know a bit more about Philanthropy Company and what we do, it's mentioned at the beginning of the previous webinar when you get the video. Last time, if you were here, you'll remember that we looked at, I guess, the sort of wider scene of environmental fundraising opportunities. What do we mean by environmental projects? How is fundraising for them? And we said basically, in a word, it's challenging or difficult. We looked at some ways in which you can try and avoid fundraising by funding things yourselves, by looking at different options and alternatives. And then we talked through some of the different types of funding. So today is, I guess, a lot more practical, and I hope that if you're here and you've already really got a project in mind, you kind of know what it is that you need to do, and you're more or less feeling like you're ready to go with funding for it, this will be very much what you need. So we're going to talk about how to plan a fundraising strategy for your environmental project. Fundraising strategy sounds quite grand. It's not that intimidating. Honestly, you'll be absolutely fine. We're going to talk about the different tools that you can use to help you and the information that you're going to need to gather in order to do the fundraising. We're going to talk quite a lot about how to communicate the need for your project, your case for support, as we often call it in the sort of fundraising world. And I'm going to take you through step by step the things that we'll need to put into that, and we'll do a worked example to show you how that might work out. And I hope that if you've got a project in mind, either one that's sort of developed or one that is kind of nascent in your church, you'll actually be able to apply that very much straight away to the particular project that is happening with you. Then we're going to talk about different styles of approach for the different types of funders. So we'll work through that list we had last time again, individual donors and events and trusts and foundations and so on. And we'll actually do some very practical, if I've got a project that's ready to go, what do I actually need to do now to start kind of raising money from that particular source? We'll finish with some common challenges and some pitfalls at the end. We're going to have two Q&A sessions. So one at the end of the section on developing your case for support, which should be about halfway through, I hope. And then another one at the end, just to break it up a bit, so that you get Catherine back and don't just have to listen to me for the whole hour and a half. So that's our plan for today. Our objectives are very simple, just two objectives. So again, do feedback to Catherine if you feel that they've been met or not, so that we can make sure we do keep these webinars being really helpful and useful to you. So first objective is to be able to create a case for support for your environmental projects. Actually, it's just the same or very similar for lots of other sorts of projects. If you've got other projects in your church, maybe a building project, or maybe you're looking for a kind of community project that involves a new member of staff, process would be very similar for that. They will bespoke it a bit today to environmental projects. And then understand how to go about each of the different types of fundraising that you will be using for your project. Now, almost certainly, no one of your projects will use all the different types of fundraising that we've considered, so you might have to do a bit of selection, but hopefully whichever ones of them you choose, you'll have a good starting point and some resources to go to help you to deliver that for your church. So that's what we're trying to achieve. So planning your fundraising strategy, first thing, you're going to deliver a strategy for how am I going to get the money to do this project, which means that the first thing that you've got to do is to understand how much your project is going to cost, which I know is stating the flipping obvious, but is definitely worth knowing that you have to do that. Okay, and I've created a little table there, which is just a kind of template of the kind of thing that you could do. Doesn't have to be incredibly detailed at this stage, but you just create a table that starts with the gross cost of your project. So if your project is, we're going to take out our boiler, our gas boiler, and we're going to put in a heat pump and an electric heat pump outside, either ground source or air source, and that involves some associated kind of, pipe work or whatever. And let's say that's this is an underestimate, I know, for that particular project, because the heat pump would cost you more than this. But let's say it's £26,000. And then we need to allow a little bit of cost for actually doing some of the things. So we might want to produce some leaflets and stuff. So there's a bit of cost in the fundraising. We're going to allow 10% contingency because these things often don't necessarily work out. That's a gross cost of the project of £30,000. So that's our cost. We think we're going to make some savings on the energy bills because of doing that. And over 5 years, that's going to be £5,000. So there's a net cost of this project of £25,000. Now, that's not always the case for environmental projects, but often you will have a gross cost, some savings that will result, because often these environmental projects are about upfront capital investments that then reduce the use of fuels. And then we'll have a net cost of £25,000. Once you've got that net cost, my rule of thumb, and it is just a rule of thumb, it's not, I've seen all sorts of different percentages where, but my rule of thumb is that you should try and raise 50% of the cost of any project from within the church. So aim for 50% of the cost of whatever project you're doing, whether it's a building project or whatever, from within the church. That doesn't all have to be given from the congregation in terms of individual gifts, either by standing order or into the plate. It could include things like using some existing reserves if you've got some, maybe selling a piece of church property if you've got sort of additional assets that you're not using. It could include a loan that you take out, and then obviously you have to have a plan to repay that loan. But if you can get 50% from within the church, then it's much easier to then get the other 50% from those external sources, such as community fundraising, companies, trusts, and foundations that we're going to talk about. Okay. Now, depending on exactly what your project is, where the benefits flow to, so if it's all a project that's entirely about benefiting the local community outside the church family, probably easier to get a bit more of the money from outside the church. If it's a project that's very much focused on benefiting the church, say, for example, where you're doing pew heaters, which is a good example, that probably means you're not getting rid of your pews if you're putting heaters in them. That probably means that your main space that you're then trying to sort of heat more efficiently is not used for lots of other community activities, because pews tend to be not conducive to doing a play group and those kind of things, which make it harder to get money from those external sources. So the percentages vary a little bit, but rule of thumb, train for 50% from within the church. And I've tried to reflect that then in the table here. So I've got £2,500 from reserves, so that's from within the church. I've got £10,000 from the congregation, that's also from the church. The savings on the energy bills, obviously that's from the church, so that's £5,000. And the £3,500 of events and sponsorships, some of that's from the church, which leaves you with £9,000 then from trusts and foundations. So you've got between £9,000 and £12,500 out of your £30,000 is coming from externally. That's fitting with that rule of thumb. Okay, so do something like that, just a rough table that says, here's what we think, where we think it's going to come from. And if you get to a point where your project, in order to make it work, is 90% funded by trusts and foundations, you may want to rethink the cost of your project a little bit. If you really can't put in that much, it may be time to rethink the project. You may come to the conclusion, no, this is the right thing to do. We've put in as much as we possibly can ourselves. We definitely do need to try and get the rest from externally. That's absolutely fine. It'll just be a bit harder. Okay. So understand your cost first. It's my first thing in doing your strategy. Second thing to do then is to allocate your resources to help you with the fundraising, because this is going to take some time and it's going to take some effort, and you need to know what those resources are. So I've got a few questions there that will really help you to do that. So firstly, who is actually leading on this project? Very often, if you're doing things like an installation of a new heating system, it's going to be somebody in your church who is really good and practical and hands-on at the kind of, managing the process of having something installed and dealing with contractors and those kind of things. And that's absolutely great. That's the right person to lead that, but just make sure that you know who it is. And then think, well, how does the fundraising function fit in with the rest of that project team? So often, if you're doing something, say, with your heating, you're going to have a little project team, and it's going to involve a number of people, perhaps people who run ministries in the church that might have to kind of be relocated or moved or changed a bit for the period of time you're doing the works. Might have your people who are used to dealing with the church fabric, might have the vicar or the curate involved with that. How does fundraising fit? So I've often seen fundraising excluded from a project team. So, what happens is typically, say it's a building project, you've got your design for a new kitchen and sort of toilet extension and add-on, and the architect says something to the team like, oh, you could do this as well. This would really help. This would improve the flow of people in the building. It'll add another £50,000 to the project costs. And then somebody just tells whoever's leading the fundraising, you've got to find an extra £50,000 without ever actually asking them, is that even possible? So you need to think about, how does the fundraising function fit with the rest of the project? Because in the end, if you can't get the money to do it, the rest of the project isn't going to happen. So that needs to be well integrated. Third allocation of resources is, have you worked out what only your vicar can do? And obviously that's not directly applicable to everybody here, I know, but for most people, you'll have an incumbent, perhaps shared with other churches. And there are some things that only they are going to be able to do. So if you've got some sort of major donors who you want someone to kind of go and talk to about the project and about their giving, it is quite likely that they will want to be approached by somebody who is senior in the church. Now, that might be your church warden, but it might well be the vicar. So there may be some tasks that you need done that only the vicar is going to be able to do. And then they need to actually find the time to do that and make it in their diary. So I was working on a project recently with a large church, £500,000 to fundraise, and basically the vicar just went, I'm not going to give any time to this. And my sense is that what that means is that their project is going to fail, because unless the sort of person who is the figurehead of the church as far as the community is concerned has made time to actually do some of the things that people won't listen if other people do them, it's not going to be very effective. So if you're on the call today and you are that vicar, I'm sorry, there will be some things that you have to do, and you'll have to clear, if it's a big project, maybe half a day a week in your diary to actually do it. And that means there'll be some other things that you can't do. And that's always a hard decision, isn't it? Because there are so many needs. But do make sure that you properly sort that out before you go any further. Fourth question to ask is your treasurer on board? So if you're going to run a fundraising project, you're going to have money coming in that might need to go into restricted funds because it's specifically for that project. You're going to need to make sure that perhaps new donors who haven't given before have got all their gift aid forms. So your treasurer and that sort of finance team are going to need to be on board with the project and connected into it, because it's not just the fundraising, there's also a finance element. Next question to ask is, who's going to work with the congregation or congregations, depending on the size of your church? So who's going to be the person who talks to people as the lead about the fundraising aspects of the project, about how it's going externally, about what people can contribute internally? My experience is that's not always best to be a member of the church staff, the vicar or the curate or somebody else, because for all sorts of reasons, there's just a perception, I think, isn't there, that somehow money given to the church is connected somehow to people who are paid by the church, even though in practice it comes from lots of different sort of pots, and incumbents in particular are funded by diocese rather than by the congregation directly. But it's worth thinking, who's the right person who's got the kind of willingness to stand up in front of the congregation, who's probably contributing themselves financially and in other ways to the project, to actually talk to people and motivate them and encourage them to give and to be part of this. If you're going to be making grant application, I think for most of these projects you probably will be. Who's actually going to do that? It's quite a time-consuming job. If you're going to do, let's say, 20 grant applications, your first one's probably going to take a couple of weeks of full-time work. After that, they do get much quicker because lots of the materials are the same. But you need somebody who's got time and energy to commit to that, and the relevant skills are always willing to acquire those skills. You don't need to be experienced in fundraising to make grant applications, particularly the bigger trusts. We'll talk about this later. Try and make it easy for someone who's not experienced, but you do need to be comfortable working online. You need to be comfortable with writing clearly and well, all those kind of things. And then once you've answered those questions, I would then suggest that you make a timeline. Most of you, no doubt at work or elsewhere, will come across Gantt charts. If you haven't, it's basically just a thing that blocks out what things are happening when, to help you keep on track with your project. And I've done a sample one here for your fundraising environmental project. So basically, just up down the left-hand side, what are the things we need to do? Recruit the fundraising team, allocate the roles, meet with the vicar about congregational giving, plan an event, congregation gift days, case for support, and so on. Each item should have a lead person, and you put their initials there. So in this fictional example, I'm leading on recruiting the fundraising team. Joe Bloggs is meeting the vicar about congregational giving. Tom, Dick and Harry are researching grant funders, and so on. And then those things are happening in particular months because you need your project delivered. Say you're planning to do the work in November, you need the funds in by October. So that's why the timeline is there. If it's a very complicated or big project, you might want to break that down further and do it week by week rather than month by month. But for most church projects, a monthly Gantt chart like that is good enough. And it just really helps everybody who's involved keep a check on whether you're on track. Okay. So that then is the outlines of your strategy. So it's the where are we getting the money from, breaking down those sources, what do we need to do in order to deliver that, who is the team, and then what activities are they undertaking in order to make that happen. That's the Gantt chart. Okay, that's the, it's not incredibly complicated. That's the brushstrokes of your strategy. The next thing you then need to do, obviously, is to answer the question, well, why would people want to give us money for this project, whether that's people in the church or people outside the church? And that is what we call the case for support. And we're going to spend about the next 20 minutes or so working through the case for support. And essentially, your case for support is just a document that sets out the answer to 6 main areas. And they're these. Why is this project needed? What difference is the project going to make, often called the impact? Remember, we talked about that last time if you were here. And why you should be the people to do it rather than somebody else doing that thing. What's it going to cost and when's it going to happen? How are you going to deliver the projects? That's kind of about management, really. How will you monitor and evaluate success? How do you know that this project is going to work, and how are you going to determine that? And how ready to go are you? And that's things like how much funding is in place. Do you have necessary permissions? So things like planning permission, building regulations, and the various internal processes of the Church of England for some types of project. We're going to work through basically all of those things together. Oh, well, I appear to have repeated that slide for reasons that I'm not sure about. Okay, move on. I think the best way for us to try and do this and to sort of show you how you might go about it is just to do it using a worked example of a particular project. Okay, so here is our worked example. We're going to work through and try and do each of those 6 things for this project, and I hope that will show you how you can do it for your own project, whatever it might be. So St Mary's, did you know, by the way, St Mary's is the commonest church name in the Church of England. There are, have a guess, take a second, think how many churches you think there are called St Mary's. Give you 5 seconds to ponder that. 2,368 St Mary's churches. This compares to 1,467 All Saints and 1,327 St Peter's. So if you're here from any of those names, congratulations. No other saint or name has more than 1,000 church dedications. Anyway, totally irrelevant, but vaguely interesting. St Mary's would like to replace its 2 aging gas boilers. It's got 2 gas boilers with pew heaters in the church and electric radiators in the kind of toilets. And then in a separate building, which is the church hall, they'd like to install a heat pump because that gets much more intensively used. They could only get 2 companies to quote for the excuse my typo, for the pew heaters. It's going to cost £10,000 to put them in. And they've got 3 quotes for the heat pump and for some additional insulation works to the church hall to make that work, cheapest and best of which was £36,000. It's going to cost them £3,000 to decommission the old boilers and to remove the pipework in the church. And they have already obtained all the necessary permissions. So this is a very typical kind of project. It sort of probably brings together 2 things that might in practice be done as separate projects, but we've brought them together for this example. So St Mary's and their little fundraising team need to create a case for support to work out how they're going to get people to fund that for them. So the first question that our team at St Mary's should be asking is, why is this project needed? And this is very much, trying to move beyond, we would really like to have this thing. So very often I see this when we're doing building projects. So I was looking at one last year where they had it would have looked beautiful. So it's an extension to a grade 2 star listed church to basically replace the kitchen facilities and do some reordering inside. And when I asked the church first why they were doing it, essentially the kind of extension project boiled down to, we don't really like having to move the chairs around in the church in order to create space for the mums and toddlers group in the week and then having to put them back again. And I, very, as kindly as I could, tried to suggest that nobody was going to give them a couple of £100,000 because they didn't like moving the chairs. Now, actually, as it turned out, once we dug into it a little bit, there were lots of much better reasons for doing it, such as that, in fact, holding the group in the church rather than the kind of proposed extension space next to the kitchen was a little bit dangerous. There were quite a lot of steps, quite a lot of valuable things, quite a lot of things small children could hurt themselves on. The entrance wasn't particularly welcoming. It was really difficult and complicated to heat it. So actually there were some quite good reasons why they needed to do it, but that just wasn't the thing that was at the top of their mind. So try and think, well, why do we need this project in a way that is compelling to people to fund? So here's what I came up with initially for St Mary's. Our 2 aging gas boilers have reached the end of their life, 18 years and 22 years respectively. So you're showing that something has to be done, definitely. They're inefficient, contributing 5 tons of carbon dioxide annually. So that's, obviously you can work out how much you are doing if you're doing a similar project just from your bills. Since the boilers require replacement, we're seeking to replace them with a green alternative. So it's a very simple case for support. Why are we doing this? Well, we need to do it anyway. We recognise that the pollution is a problem. We're looking for a green alternative. Okay. You could add some more to that if you want to. So you show perhaps that you've looked at other options. So we've investigated biomass boilers and replacing it with an electric system, and we've concluded that this is the cheapest option. And we've also got a report that shows why it's not really economical to maintain the current boilers, because we can't get parts and if they go wrong or whatever it might be. Okay, excuse the police cars going past outside. So you state clearly and succinctly why the project is needed. That's the first part. Next thing to do is to think about the impact. So what difference is this project going to make? Well, in the case of a project like this, it's probably, again, fairly straightforward. So the project will enable us to heat the church and church hall entirely using green electricity, and to reduce our carbon footprint by 80%. And again, these are the sorts of figures you can fairly easily work out from your bills. It will also reduce the running cost of our heating by 20%, which helps to make the church more financially sustainable. Okay, so you've got a really clear statement of what the impact is going to be. Again, perhaps there are some additions that you might be able to put into this. For example, you might be the first public building in your village to try and kind of go entirely green in your heating. And you could then, that's part of your impact, isn't it? So we're the first public building in the village to do this, and we're really going to, very much try and use this to have an educational impact. We're going to, make sure that we work with the local school, with other local groups to show how maybe they could do this too. We're going to talk about the issues. So there'll be an additional impact beyond the immediate carbon, perhaps. So it's worth thinking about what are the wider impacts that you might be able to have. While I'm here, I did just spot a question in the chat earlier on about someone basically saying, since there's a national grid, isn't buying green electricity just a swizz because we don't know the electricity we're getting out of our plug sockets is the green electricity, which is a question lots of people have. It's a really good question. The answer to it is, if you want to answer that question for maybe the more skeptical people in your church, yes, you don't know which electric unit is which, of course, but the way that green tariffs work in the UK is that every unit of electricity you use on a green tariff has to be matched by a unit of green electricity that's being put into the grid at the generation side. And what that means is, if everybody says, I want to buy green electricity, it increases the demand for green electricity, and it pushes the people who generate electricity to generate more of their electricity using wind and solar and so on. And it decreases demand for gas and coal generated electricity, and it helps to change the whole market. So like many of the things to do with greening, in one sense, your individual thing doesn't make an enormous amount of difference. But when we all do it together, and it's why things like the sort of collective buying of, green tariffs by the Church of England is so powerful. When we all do it together, it does make a big difference to the amount of green electricity that is needed, and helps those producers who are installing wind farms and solar panels to know that there will be demand for what they're doing, and therefore make them want to do more of it. Aside, but I thought I'd just mention that as we go. So First thing you're going to do, as we said, is demonstrate why it's needed. Second thing, we're going to talk about the impact. Third thing you're going to do in your case for support is to look at the costs and the timeline. And we've already done that above. We know what the costs are from our St Mary's illustration. So the heat pump and installation works at £36,000. The boilers removal and pipes is £3,000. The pew heaters are £10,000. My math says that costs £49,000. So you've worked out the cost of the project and you set that out in your case for support. Obviously, we're mentioned this before, if you're uncertain about any of those costs, so if you're the people who have come and done the quotes for you say, well, we think it will cost £3,000 to remove the boilers and the pipes, but there's this one section where we're not sure if they're buried in concrete or not, and that might cost a bit more. You should definitely, unless you've got really clear fixed costs, add a little bit of contingency, maybe 5%, maybe 10%, depending on the project, to those costs, so that you don't get a nasty surprise. So you set out your costs for your case of support, and then your timeline. So we intend to install the pew heaters in May 2022 and the heat pump in June 2022. And I've put those dates in deliberately because if you're starting now, that's probably a realistic timeframe for fundraising for a project like this. And I would definitely suggest that you do not try and change your heating system during the winter, because people will be cold and that would be unpleasant. So that's your next thing that we're going to set out, the cost and the timeline. Next, in your case of support, you're going to set out your track record as a church for why you can deliver this project. So why are you capable of doing this? And this is particularly true if it's a bigger project and you're a smaller church. So, if you create a project to do a sort of really big piece of work, which is creating maybe a big set of sort of field of solar panels in a field next to the churchyard, and heat pump and some big insulation works that involve kind of big changes to your building, and maybe it's an intensively used building, so that's really worth doing, but your annual income as a church is £100,000 and the project's a £200,000 project, people funding you, they're going to want to know that you know how to deal with that kind of size of project. So something like, our church has experience of managing projects of this nature. Project teams led by Joe Bloggs, who oversaw the re-roofing and installation of modern double glazing to the church hall in 2011. So you're just reassuring funders that, well, we know what we're doing. We've done projects like this before. We can deal with contractors, all those, that you're giving them confidence that this can work. We have selected preferred contractors for the works and the quotations received, both of whom have extensive experience working with churches. So again, you're reassuring funders that, this is not just a bunch of people who don't know what they're doing. Both the client, the church, knows how to run a project, and the delivery side, the contractors, know what they're doing working with churches. So you're just setting out, how are we going to deliver this project? At this point, you might want to, if you've got a little project team delivering this, you might want to introduce one of those organograms. You'll have seen those for organizational structures, which just show who the different people are, what the relationship is to each other, and who's managing the project. Again, particularly the bigger the project, the more of that kind of detail is really reassuring and helpful to funders. Monitoring and evaluation. So basically, this is, how are you going to know your project is a success? That's actually much easier for many of these environmental projects than it is for other projects. So if your project was that you were looking for a salary for a new youth worker for an open youth work in your church, because there's maybe not much provision in your town or village, actually the monitoring and evaluation is quite complicated, because it's going to take place over a number of years, and it might look at not just how many people sort of are engaged by your youth work, but where do they come from geographically? Are they from areas of deprivation? You'd have quite a lot of perhaps fairly complicated ways of working out whether it was successful. With a project like this, fairly simple to work out whether it's successful. So the first measure of success is just going to be, we actually install the things we say we're going to install. So the heat pump and the pew heaters get put in and they're working. That's a critical one. But then also it's going to be, did you meet the things you said it was going to achieve back here? So you'll recall back here, we talked about the impact, reducing carbon footprint, reducing running costs. So then in your monitoring and evaluation, you should be showing, how are you going to know that you've had that impact? So the way we're going to know, new heating system includes smart monitors, can review energy use in real time, can ensure that the church and hall are only heated when required. We're already using green electricity tariff, so we'll ensure that the power used is matched with clean energy entering the grid. And then you can say, we'll monitor the bills and we'll understand whether or not we're saving our 20% that we said we would. Okay, so you're going to talk about how you're monitoring it. And then the final bit that you're going to talk about in your case of support is the fundraising. So lots of funders will want to know, we'll talk about this a bit more later on when we talk about trusts and foundations, like how much of the money have you got already? Where is the project at? Is it really likely to happen? So you're going to say, we've already raised £15,000 from congregational giving and allocated from our reserves, plan to fund the balance of the cost, £34,000 as follows. Actually, I think these figures don't match the ones I gave you before, so ignore the numbers, but you get the idea. We're going to have some individual giving, we're going to have an event, we're going to get some grants. Particularly if you're applying for grants, most grant funders won't want to be the only one who are funding the project. That includes the very big ones like the lottery. They'll still be looking for you to kind of involve other grant funders. So it's often worth saying something like, as well as our application to you, we are applying to, and I've given some examples there, FCC Communities Foundation, that's a landfill tax credit trust, we'll talk about them later. Garfield Weston Foundation, big well-known foundation who fund lots of work in churches. All Churches Trust, which is the charitable arm of ecclesiastical insurance. Again, many of you will have had funds from them before, and 5 smaller local trusts. So you're setting out how much we've already got, how are we going to find the difference. Part of it's from you, who we are applying to now, we're applying to all these other places. Okay, so that's your case for support. How long should that be? Well, it depends. My general recommendation is, if you can have a version of that that is maybe 2 or 3 sides of A4. For a small project, it could be less, between 1 and 2. And it's also really useful to have a 1-sentence and a 1-paragraph version of it as well. So the 1-sentence version is, we are doing this, which will achieve this because this. We are installing brand new green heating mechanisms for our church and church hall, which will reduce our carbon footprint by 80% because our existing boilers need replacing. That's your 1-sentence case for support. And you might even want to write at a cost of £49,000, you might add that in. And then the 1-paragraph version just takes that and gives a little bit more detail. So it tells a bit more of a story. Now, current boilers have been installed for nearly 20 years and they're failing. It's time to replace them. We're really conscious of the need to of the climate emergency. So we want to use green replacements both to reduce our carbon footprint and to be a model for other community buildings in our area to show what can be done. This is going to cost this much. Okay, so it's really helpful to have this, what you might call an elevator pitch version of your case for support as well. Okay, you've had 38 minutes of me, so it's probably time for some questions.
We've had some really interesting questions come into the Q&A.
Excellent.
Do you want to keep slide up there, or should we share it so that you're bigger for people?
Oh, let's stop the share, because
there we go.
I mean, it's not that interesting looking at me, but it might be marginally more interesting than looking at the slide.
Oh, there's such interesting questions. Okay, so I'll just take them from the top. The first one is about monitoring, and if a church includes in a project educational elements, how might they be able to kind of report back or monitor whether they've had that educational kind of community impact? It's easier with the carbon side. How about that kind of community engagement side?
That's a great question. Thank you, Jane, who asked that. So let's say that what you're doing is take a different example. It's a kind of wilding project in some of your church grounds, and it's going to cost a certain amount of money. The educational element might be, we've agreed to work with our local primary school to bring the children in certain year groups, every term or every month over a year. So perhaps you've had a conversation with the school and they've decided that the year 2 curriculum fits really well with this, in terms of it talks about some of the things that would be a really good connection. So we're going to bring all the kids in year 2 once a month through the year so they can see what happens, and we're going to do that for 3 years. So your reporting is, did we do this? So did those children come? So that's your monitoring. Your success monitoring is they actually, the kids all came. And then your sort of quality monitoring is, here are 5 things that the children said at the end of the year about their experience and why it was valuable to them. And you could then report those back to the funders. And my suggestion would be, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in Trust and Foundations if we have time, that even where funders don't ask for that kind of qualitative evaluation, that you send it to them anyway, because it shows that you've really understood that you think their funding makes a difference. And just because funders are people too, that's always a really good idea. And it means that if you want to go back and ask for something else in 5 years' time, they're likely to remember, oh, they were those really lovely people who sent, you know, a little video of the children saying how much they'd enjoyed the opportunity to do it. And also those are great things to do with your congregation. So again, if you've done something and it really benefits kids in the local school, actually, if you just get, you know, some of those kids or their teacher doing a little piece of video that you can play in your Sunday morning service, it inspires people that my giving made a difference. And that's absolutely critical to those things. So yeah, education, definitely, you know, who's coming, how often are they coming, and then what did they make of it would be a good example of monitoring there.
I'm thinking of a church that I worked with on an application for funding for a lighting project. And the initial feedback from the funder was that there wasn't enough community engagement. It was just putting in lights. And they discussed it with the funder and agreed that they would put in that there would be a time at the church when they spoke to the whole congregation about the lighting project and gave everyone an LED bulb and a leaflet about how you could replace your lights at home, which cost about another £1,000, which the funder was happy to pay. And on that basis, they got the grant for doing the church lighting. So it can be things like that, but, you know, not just doing the project, but telling people you're doing the project and engaging them in it. Yeah. The next question is about the length of time to be looking at business cases. It says, is business case over 25 years appropriate for calculating the net present value, for example, for solar panels, the costs, the savings and maintenance? Actually, there's a useful question that points to as well about when a church is working out its cost budget, should it just be the installation or should it be the lifetime cost?
It is a really great question. So I guess the answer to the 25-year question is, I guess it depends exactly what the thing is, and you should be advised by your solar panel, in this case installer, what the realistic lifespan of the unit is, and you can calculate your costs over that period of your sort of costs and savings over that period of time. I think most funders, in terms of making an application for funding, government funding may be a little bit of an exception. We'll talk about that later, but most funders won't require that level of the sort of technicality level of net present value costs over 25 years, because they recognize that, in fact, for most organizations like churches, actually, you know, the borrowing of the money can't be done at a sufficiently, so say you're doing over 25 years, you're not necessarily going to get the money at a sufficiently cheap rate to make that repayment worthwhile unless there's a very high return on the investment. So I would suggest that for most purposes, taking over 5 and 10 years, working out what your savings might be, and then sort of removing that from the net cost. If, and this relates to another question later that's come from Joanne, if you have the money up front to put into that and can then effectively repay yourselves from the sort of capital money that you have put in. Obviously, if you're a church, as many churches are, without significant reserves that you can use to fund that up front, you've then got 2 options. One is you just go, we're going to make some savings, but we're going to try and get the money in the form of grants and gifts anyway up front, because we will need that money that we're making the savings on for other aspects of our ministry down the line. Or if it's a reasonable period of time that, you know, you can repay it over, you could potentially get a loan to cover those costs that you're then going to save and pay the loan back out of the savings over a number of years. So yeah.
The next question is from Richard, which is about VAT. I think you were keeping things nice and simple in your table and not considering VAT. Some works for some churches can be reclaimed from the listed places of worship scheme. So presumably, if you're a listed church and if it's an eligible cost, then you can include that in your funding table.
Yes, absolutely. So I would, yes, you're right. I kept it simple, but yes, your gross cost should definitely include VAT, because you may well have to pay it up front and then be able to recover it. So it's, from a cash flow point of view, you need it in the gross cost. And then your list or funders can include the listed places of worship scheme from which you recover the VAT So you would just add that as another line in your income effectively. But great question, Richard. Thank you.
So that's useful to know that you would, if you were putting in an application to another funder, you would include the listed places of worship as a funder rather than it just going out, coming back.
Absolutely, yeah, because again, funders want to know that you have thought of all the possible avenues, and lots of them will know about the LPW scheme, but they will want to know that you have thought of it too. So if you put it in, like, this is the cost including VAT, we're getting the VAT back from, or some of the VAT back from listed places of worship, that reassures particularly those bigger funders, Lottery, Garfield Weston Foundation and so on, that you're on top of how it all works.
Great. The next question from Joe is about whether the points you've been making for your example of the heating project, are they applicable for a biodiversity project, making that same case of support, but obviously having different kinds of answers for a biodiversity project?
Absolutely, yeah, great question, Joe. Thank you. So definitely, all of the same process applies, but what the benefits are and what the impacts are different, aren't they? So your impact for biodiverse garden of remembrance might be we're hoping that we will find X different or new species that we're not currently getting in the garden present, and you could measure that by getting a survey done. And again, that's another great education thing, because maybe that's another way to involve a school or whatever. But it's also how many people are going to visit that. What difference is it going to make in your community as part of the wider offer of the church? Is it going to encourage more people to come to other events, or all those kinds of questions? So I always start by just being asking very non-technical questions. So when you're planning your project, just sit down and have a little mind map with your project team or other people, and just go, well, what difference is it going to make? What's going to happen because we've done this? And you'll come up with a list of ideas, and then a good number of those will be quantifiable. You'll be able to measure them, and so you can definitely put those in. And it's also fine sometimes to put in impacts that are not quite so measurable. So, people in our church who are coming in will feel more welcome because the space will be warmer. That's a legitimate impact for your project. And then you can measure that by just asking people. So how, if you're front, and some funders will ask, how are you going to measure this impact that you said you'll have? The answer is, we're going to ask people after a year, does the church building feel more welcoming and warmer now that we've done this project? Yes or no? That would be how you'd measure that impact. So almost any project, whatever you're doing, will have some impacts that you can measure and somehow or other, and you should include those.
And I think it would be true to say that with green spaces projects, you've got two kinds of funders open to you, don't you? Because there are the ones who care about the pollinators that you're going to help, and there are ones who care about the people in your community who you're going to engage in doing the gardening. That might be a mental health group, or it might
Absolutely.
be a youth group.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And with all of these projects, I think the more funders are interested in people than anything else, because that's mostly the reason that people set up charitable foundations. And therefore, anything you can do that shows how this project positively impacts people, as you say, whether it's, we've got a group of older people who are maybe a bit isolated, we're going to involve them in some gentle gardening, and that's great for their mental health. Or we're going to get those older people, and we're going to get the schools together as well, and we're actually going to do some intergenerational stuff. People really love that. So thinking about whatever this project is, how does it positively impact people and their lives, is a really great way to think about those sort of impact measurements.
We've got more great questions. I'm just checking with you. How many more do you want now before you go to the second half of your...
We're only 5 minutes past half. Do 2 more? Let's do 2 more.
Okay. The first, I imagine, will ring true with a lot of people. This comes to Seal. We're a small church with a completely broken heating system, very little money, and not many people with skills. What do you do if you have nobody to lead the project? Can the PCC collectively be the project lead? There's no easy answer to that question, is there, Andrew? But what wisdom do you have?
Yeah, thanks to Seal for that. I feel for you. I know lots of people are in this situation, and it is really difficult. I think the answer to your question is, you can do anything that works. So don't feel that nothing I say is intended to be like, this is the only way to do it. There are lots of different ways to do it, and to some extent you just need to find the thing that's going to work for you, given the resources and the people that you've got. So I hope that's sort of helpful. I would say, generally speaking, what you need with tasks, where you've got tasks, is one person needs to take responsibility for a task. So because if you don't, then just nobody does stuff, because life is like that, isn't it? So if somebody's going to fill in the application form to make an application to help with your heating to the Garfield Weston Foundation, somebody needs to do that. Now, somebody else might be able to help with some bits of the questions, and you might sort of farm those out. Oh, could you do this one? Somebody else might read it through and proofread it. But it's like taking that sense of each task we have, somebody's going to be responsible for it. And if one person, and whether you call them the project lead or not, it doesn't matter at all. But if one person just sort of takes emotional ownership of whatever the thing is, I think that's really important. So it doesn't need to be that one person does all the work, absolutely not. And I know that, you know, it's challenging when there's not very many of you, and definitely try and divvy out the jobs as widely as you can. But it's really helpful if someone can go, this is my thing, and I'm going to take responsibility for it and kind of drive to make sure that it happens. And, you know, and that's a hard ask, because generally speaking, what happens is, you know, maybe that'll end up being you, Cecile, and you're probably already doing that with 20 other things, because that's the kind of person that you are, because you're here today. So, you know, that's a tough thing, and don't take on more than you're able to do, because that's not good for anybody. But I think it's really helpful if one person can sort of take ownership and be like, I will make sure this happens, even if lots of other people are doing lots of the actual things to make it happen. You're bringing it together.
So Holly's one is a comment rather than a question about funders wanting to know about the maintenance costs of systems. Are they going to increase or decrease? Yeah. And how will those maintenance costs be covered in the long term, and training for PCCs in using new systems? That's absolutely your experience as well.
Really helpful comment. And if you're doing anything that is sort of technical, you know, this would apply if you're looking for funding for sort of PA and sound systems as well, which is quite a common one. Actually, some, you know, and it's not more than a paragraph, but it's going, our program for making sure that everybody knows how to use this is, you know, we'll get the people who are installing it to train 4 people, and that sort of covers all the different Sundays. And then we're going to have cascaded training down to others to make sure that this is done properly, and there's a maintenance contract in place, etc., etc. So yeah, great. Thanks, Holly.
Do you want to tick off the last 2, or are you starting again?
I think
the next one says,
Jane's question is, yeah, absolutely. Project vision is a great way to describe it. Charles's question, I think we'll cover that a little bit as we talk about major donors. So we'll come back to that.
Lovely. In which case?
Excellent. Right, now I'm working out how to get my screen share back. I think that should be working.
Good from here.
Great. Okay, so we're going to spend the second half, a bit less than half, just thinking about the different types of fundraising that we mentioned last time, and just a sort of very, you know, some overview introductions about how are you going to start doing each of these types of fundraising. As I said, most of you won't be using all of them for your project, unless it's a really large project. So, you know, some will be more relevant than others, but hopefully thinking about what you have to do might help you decide which ones you're going to go for. Okay, firstly, individual donations from inside the church. This is from your regular congregation or even your less regular congregation. First thing to say is, do plan how you're going to do this. I think often when it's people we know, they're people we see every week, we can end up being a little bit haphazard about how we kind of do the giving piece. So it's worth saying, make sure that you plan your fundraising inside the church just as carefully as you plan your fundraising from trusts and foundations or whoever else. Second thing, and we see this all the time in churches, don't we, is the assumption that people know quite a lot about the project already, because you feel like you've been talking about this thing probably for 18 months at, you know, a PCC meeting or a subgroup, and you're probably like, your head is full of it, and you may even be a bit fed up with it already. It's easy to assume that everybody else is also kind of in that zone. Whereas the reality is, you know, as a church leader, I did the notices on Sundays for 10 years, and most people don't listen, most of them. So don't assume that people know much already. And it's much better to tell people things they already know than it is to assume things and then have things go over people's heads. If you're doing any kind of ask for funds for a particular project, you're having a special gift day, or you're doing some sort of appeal or event, try and make sure that it aligns well with the sort of regular giving for ministry And you may have particular moments in your church calendar when you tend to do, like a gift Sunday, or maybe you do a mission Sunday, and you just need to make sure that that fits in, and that you're not going to upset anybody by doing, your gift day for the heat pump project the week before the missions gift day, and then that's problematic and you upset some other people, and it probably doesn't help in terms of the giving. Okay, so always sort of think about, how does this fit in with the regular giving? Now, it might well be that you want to bring those things together, so that maybe you're a church in a university town, and you tend to do a sort of gift thing at the end of October or the beginning of November, because that's when lots of new people have moved into the town to start new jobs, to start new courses of study, and they're just about settling in the church and they're going to start giving. Or it may be that you're in maybe a more sort of suburban setting, and actually sort of the kind of post-Easter time is a really good time to do stuff about giving, because it's the new tax year, and people who are in sort of regular employment are beginning to think pay rises and all that kind of stuff. So just work out, how is this going to fit in with our regular giving kind of calendar, and talking about generosity and stewardship. It is always worth planning for some cannibalization, I don't like that word, but I couldn't think of a better one, of the existing giving. So if you're doing a project that's going to involve raising £50,000 for a heat pump, and maybe half of that's coming from the church family, so £25,000, and your regular giving is £100,000 a year, you're not going to lose £25,000 a year out of that regular giving, but you might lose £5,000 this year, because people will give to one rather than the other. Most of your most committed people will they'll keep their sort of regular giving to your regular ministry going, but some people will swap from one to the other, especially if your new project is quite kind of exciting one that grabs people's imagination. You'll get some transfer. So just allow for that in your budgeting and your planning for the year. This is particularly important. It's a thing lots of churches get wrong when they're doing sort of giving internally. Decide whether you want money people to give to be restricted funds, and that's a sort of technical accounting term. And if they are going to be restricted funds, how restricted are they going to be? So I was working with a church recently that had basically got a building project, and they decided they were basically going to move out of their existing building and move into an entirely new building sort of just down the road. And the way that the giving form that they sort of gave out to people to give was phrased meant that they could only use the money for buying the new building down the road. And in the end, the site that they were going to build on got bought by somebody else, and they actually worked out that it was impossibly expensive compared to the amount they could raise to do that. And what they needed to do was completely refurbish their existing building instead. But they couldn't use the money they'd raised from the congregation to refurbish their existing building, because it was restricted in law under the sort of accounting thing. So they then had to go back to each individual donor who had given and ask them to reassign the giving to a different fund. And that was very complicated and messy. So it's worth thinking, how do we want to phrase this when we're asking people to give? And ideally, and particularly with your own church family, what you want to do is just to ask them to give the money generally to the church, but with the understanding that your plan is that you are going to spend it on this project. But if for some reason it doesn't work out, and something happens to heat pump technology that makes it not really viable, and biomass becomes suddenly a much better way of achieving your goal, that you can use the funds for that purpose without having to go back to them individually and ask. Okay, so it's worth thinking about that and having a conversation, particularly with your treasurer, and perhaps with some diocesan advisors, about just how to phrase that. Next thing to say about individual donations in churches, to make the mechanisms as simple and appropriate as is possible. So again, if you're maybe a sort of urban church, maybe you've got a predominantly young congregation, making absolutely does the digital giving or the contactless giving work really well and really straightforwardly? If you're asking people in their 20s to write you a check to pay for something, they're not going to do it because they haven't got a checkbook. They're probably, some of my kids have never seen a checkbook, I don't suppose. So what's an appropriate mechanism for who your congregation is and their age and stage, and how do you make that really simple and straightforward for them? So develop a mechanism that really works for you and your church. And then finally, and I hope this goes without saying, but basically build theological connections and build it into your worship. So even if you're a church, and many churches I know now don't take a plate offering on Sunday and sort of bring it to the front, like, even if that's not your standard practice as a church, because you really want to make visitors feel more welcome and so on, and that's all absolutely fine. Different churches like to do different things. Sometimes doing some of those things that you don't normally do can be very powerful and very effective, and just helps people to see, you know, this is not just funding pew heaters. This is part of our commitment to God and his gospel, and to generosity, and to loving other people, and to our worship. So build theological connections and worship. If you've not yet visited the Church of England's microsite, Building a Generous Church, Google that term and go on some really great resources there that will help you with that sort of wider theological stuff. Okay, so that's some tips on doing it inside the church. Engaging individual donations outside the congregation. The best way to do that is always to think relationally. So people give to people in the end, generally, rather than to projects. So, you know, if you think about all the events that happened in the pandemic last year, what was the one thing that most captured the public's imagination about giving? Captain Tom. It was Captain Tom. And in the end, people gave millions of pounds, not particularly to the causes that the money ended up going to, though they were all great causes. Basically, we gave the money to Captain Tom because we totally admired who he was and what he was choosing to do for the sake of others, even though it was probably painful for him and difficult. Okay, so people give to people. So when you're thinking about getting donations from outside your core congregation, think relationally. Okay, who is most likely to give to something in your church? Well, it's the family and friends of the people who are in your church. So you may well have folk in your church who, you know, they were brought up in the church as kids, and then they've left to go to university, and they've not come back. They may not even go to church anywhere anymore, but actually they're still really fond of your church and what it did and the difference it made to their life, and would happily give if their mum or dad who still go to the church, or their grandparents who still go to the church, were to ask them if they would do that, or to go, oh, we're doing this heating project, here's a leaflet, would you think about it? It doesn't need to be a big heavy thing. So think about those kinds of people. Think about alumni. So, you know, some people who leave churches leave in difficult circumstances or under a cloud, and you probably wouldn't want to ask them because it might be difficult. But lots of people leave just because they move somewhere else. You know, their job takes them somewhere else, they get married to someone who lives elsewhere, but they're still really fond of your church. And if you are in touch with those people anyway, you know, you can ask them. Now, there are some sort of data protection issues here, so talk to folk in your diocese if you're concerned about those. But actually, individual people in your church are always free to ask those that they're in contact with. So not the church doing it itself, it's just individual. So you've got people in your church who are in touch with someone who left a few years ago. It's absolutely fine for them to put something on Facebook and go, oh, we're doing this, you know, would you be interested? Here's the link. Other people who use the church building. So that's not necessarily, you know, so your building or hall may be used by a whole variety of groups. The people who go to those groups may well be willing to help. They are probably a little bit more distantly connected to those sort of previous groups, but they may well be willing to be engaged. Other community hubs might collect for you. So, you know, the pub and the shop, even the kind of, you know, the sort of the very traditional collecting jar on the bar can absolutely work. They might run an event for you. They might be willing to receipt, you know, you might be able to say, well, you know, people in the village who want to give can just, you know, hand in an envelope at the shop, and it'll be looked after and then passed on to the church. You're just trying, again, things to make it easy to get the money in. Don't forget, in this age, social media networks and online fundraising. Loads of people want to give online and spend a lot of time online, and that is not just young people. So the biggest users of Facebook are the over 60s, and the average age of a Facebook user in the UK now, I think, is something like 43. So this sort of online social media stuff, not just for millennials, or even the new generation, whatever they're called, alphas, are they now? Anyway, wherever we're up to. And then web platforms like Just Giving, there are others, Just Giving is the best known, provide a really easy way to actually sort of set up the mechanism for giving. So you can publicize what you're doing on things like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, whatever the places are that people are found who might give to you, and then take them to something like Just Giving. You'll pay out, you know, people are often sort of a bit funny about the fees that those kind of platforms charge. Every kind of fundraising has costs associated with the money, you know, whether it's handling cash or whatever. So they'll charge you a little bit of money, but they'll also give you a really great service and enable you to get people to give in a way that's easy and straightforward. Then the last thing to get engaging individual donations outside the congregation is that you might, as it were, if you've got a really big circle of some of those groups like alumni, so maybe you are a city centre church with loads and loads of students who have kind of come and gone through the years, and that might work. You might get reasonably substantial sums. Most churches are not going to get loads of money through doing this. So don't do it just for the fundraising, but it is just a really great way to reconnect with some people who have been part of your church life. Maybe some of those alumni actually, they left the church and they were quite happy, but maybe they've moved back into the area, or they'd come back, or maybe there are some people who's doing this project just re-engages the grandchildren of some of your church members who do still live in the area. They think, actually, it's time to bring come back to the mums and tots group, or whatever it might be. Okay, so don't do it just for the fundraising. It's not going to raise you loads of money, but it may have lots of other spin-off benefits if you do it well. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about events. How are you going to do events fundraising? Well, generally speaking, as we said last time, this is not going to raise loads of money, but again, it does have lots of other spin-off benefits in terms of engaging people, letting people know what you're doing, publicizing all of your project. Understand, first of all, the purpose of your event and budget accordingly. So I've done some really great events as basically launch events for a fundraising campaign. I'm working with the church at the moment to plan one for a kind of big re-roofing project that they're doing. And the launch event is basically budget neutral. So we are asking people to pay to come to it, and it's going to be a kind of nice meal. But we're not. It's not a fundraising event, and we're clear with people it's not a fundraising event. It's just covering its costs, and the purpose of it is just to engage a bunch of people who might give to this, in addition to sort of paying their £20 or whatever it is we're charging for the dinner, and to tell them a little bit about what's happening, what's going on. And engage them in sort of bringing other people to hear about it and so on. So what's the purpose of the event, and then budget. If it's a straight fundraising event and you want it to make £2,000, you need to set a budget that enables it to make £2,000. Before you finalize the details and the dates, do a little bit of research in the market, especially if it's a new type of event, and a bit of research about the competition, which doesn't necessarily mean other people doing the same thing. But if you're in a relatively small place, a town or suburb, and there's another big thing on that weekend that everybody always goes to every year, maybe don't do your event that weekend. So just make sure you know what else is happening around. And if there's so the event you're planning is a sort of Christmas related thing, is there some other organization in your little town or suburb that does that they do the Christmas thing? And if there is, can you do it at a slightly different time or a very different kind of event in order to make it work? If you've done events before, don't be afraid to build on previous successes. So things that work, well, maybe the easiest way to make a little bit more money is to do the thing that worked really well before, and just do it a bit bigger, get some more people to come, because you know what you're doing, you know how it works, you've got all the kind of skills, and you can build on that success. In any kind of event like this, you're going to have probably different people sort of spending different little pots of money, whether it's on, getting stuff to create stalls at a fete, or it's on some of you doing a sort of dinner event and it's like the catering. Please ensure that the people who have those budgets know that that is a limit and not a suggestion. So it's very easy for an event that would have made a profit to just go into loss, because basically just people spent more money. Everybody spent a bit more money than they were meant to. And that took away all of the money that was actually meant to go to the project that you were doing. And finally, a successful fundraising event is 80% about income, sales, and attendance. So whether it's successful is 80% about the income and about 20% about controlling the costs. So controlling the costs is really important. But actually, if you get lots and lots of people, then you are much more likely to make significant sums, because with most events, there's a core cost to having the event, and then a marginal cost that each additional attendee adds. So you're doing a big dinner event, obviously there's a cost of the food and the meal, but then actually there's a bunch of fixed costs as well. And so for every additional person, you're actually making it a higher percentage of that money is going towards the good cause that you want it to. That's some thoughts about how to get started in events. Let's talk a little bit about major donors. How are you going to do that sort of work of, we said last time, it's the people who are giving maybe £5,000 and more, either as a one-off or over a period of time. Well, the first thing to do is to work out who those people are. So sit down with a couple of others who know the area and the congregation well, and just identify who do we think might fall into this category, who might be able to give at that kind of scale that's going to make a big impact on the amount of money that we've got. And then you'll end up with a bunch of names. Okay. And some of those names you'll know super well, and there'll be people you know really well and have a really great relationship with. Others of them might be a little bit more distant. So the next thing to do then is to say, okay, well, who could approach those people to have a conversation with them about whether they would be interested in supporting this and willing to help us? And that's a really important step, because, you know, as I always say, as a fundraiser, nobody ever wanted me to be that person. Okay, so most of my major donors at the museum, they didn't want me to go and ask them for money. They wanted Sir David, who was the chair of our board, or Laura, who was the chief executive of the museum. That's who they wanted to ask them, because they wanted to know that their donation was being taken seriously. And I know in a church context, sometimes that kind of, well, how do we deal with people who think they're important and all the rest of it? Just part of those questions. It's just a matter of respect. Okay, it's just like, actually, we're asking you for something quite big that's making a big difference to what we do. So it should be somebody sort of senior who comes and asks you and who makes the time and effort to do that. So who should the approach come from? So it might be the vicar, it might be someone who is there very much their peer in maybe in sort of, you know, in business or in your community. It might be church wardens. So, you know, who's the right person to make that approach? One of the things I often do is to use potential major donors as a test for my case for support. So if you've got people who might give substantial sums, like actually whether or not what you've written as a case for support is persuasive, they'd be a great person to test that on, wouldn't they? Because they are potentially being asked to stick a lot of money where their mouth is. So a really great first step can be, once you've worked out, you know, who are you going to ask and who should the approach come from, for that person who's making the approach, let's say it's your church warden, to speak to the person you're going to your potential major donor and say, we're doing this project and it's, you know, it's basically going to do this, and we've kind of come up with a way of stating why we think we need to do it and what the benefits are, and I wondered if you'd just sit down with me for half an hour and like let me run it past you and see what you think. And I would explicitly say at that point, and I'm not going to ask you to support that, you know, that thing today. I'm not going to ask for money. Okay. And once you've done that, if they are obviously genuinely interested, and you'll be able to tell whether they're really interested, you can then say, would you be willing to have a meeting where we talk about how you might support this project as a second meeting? And if at that point, if they don't want to support it, they are absolutely free to say no. Nobody's kind of offended or upset or hurt. You've still actually had something really useful out of it because you've got feedback on your case for support that you've written, and it's been a healthy and a good relationship. Okay. If they say yes, they want that meeting, well, whoever the right person to approach is can go back, and they should go back knowing exactly what they're going to ask for. So they talk through this, you know, what you're trying to do, again, using the sort of revised case for support, following the feedback that they've had, and say, we wondered if you might be able to give £10,000 to this project. Okay, and it's not essential, but it's really helpful to go with a specific amount. And all my experience is, most people say either yes, or they say no, and either of those is fine, or they'll come back with some variation of their own, which is like, yeah, I would really like to support this, but I'd like to do it through this charitable trust that I'm a trustee of, and you know, you should make an application to them. Or they'll say, yeah, I'm willing to give to this, but I'd actually like to give you a slightly smaller amount to start with, you know, to get the project to this point, and then a slightly bigger amount once you've raised the rest of the money, or whatever it might be. Okay, so it's very much relational, but it's also being really clear, really honest with people, open about what you're asking for, not hiding anything, clear when you're not going to ask them for money, clear when you are going to ask them for money, all those just very basic kind of communication tools. Legacies. Let me get a quick plug in right at the top for Free Wills Month, October 2022. So if you've never done anything on legacies in your church before, why not stick in your church newsletter next week that Free Wills Month is in October 2022, that anyone in your church can go to that website and they can book an appointment with a solicitor in your area who will draw up a will for free for them. Not conditional upon them leaving money to the charities that sponsor Free Wills Month, or indeed any other charity, but obviously hoping that they will do so. So that's a thing you could do straight away, irrespective of any project that you're doing. Second thing to say about legacy, it's a long-term project doing legacies. It's not necessarily about, you know, the heat pump you're going to install next year, but it's still worth doing because it helps secure your church's future in the long term. And it's very simple, basically, to do this. You know, it's possibly the easiest set of actions from a fundraising point of view. You just need to create a little information pack, could be a single leaflet. There's loads of great resources at the website there, churchlegacy.org.uk, that you can use to help you do that. I think there are some generic things you can kind of print off, but I'd probably make one that's a little bit bespoke to your church. It doesn't have to be sort of very glossy. Showing that there's a really amazing video at churchlegacy.org.uk, which is the Church of England's kind of bespoke legacies website. Just a really beautifully shot, really interesting, really thoughtful video. Why not show that in your service one Sunday? And then ask people to let the church know, maybe the treasurer is the most appropriate person, but to let someone in the church know if they're planning to leave a legacy, not so that you can kind of monitor people, but just so you can thank them, because you should definitely treat someone who's going to leave a legacy. They're a major donor, just that the money's kind of coming later, but they are a major donor to your church, and it's really important to be able to thank them. And the other thing is just to say, make legacies a regular part of your church's stewardship conversation. So however often you have those kinds of discussions in your church, whether it's part of the sermon and the teaching, whether it's part of the act of worship, whether it's just a little notice in the notice sheet, just make talking about legacies normal and regular, and, you know, not a weird big thing, because it shouldn't be a weird big thing. It's a thing that we can talk, you know, you don't want to mention it every week, but a few times a year, the word legacy should make its way into your church's conversation. Next, we're nearly there, people. Corporate support. I would say sponsorship from companies, probably not a priority for most environmental projects. It's not a biggie. Two exceptions though. Water companies. So it's always worth checking if your local water company might support this, because they have lots of environmental projects, or at least some of them do. And landfill tax credit schemes. So many of you will have used these. So basically, whenever waste goes to landfill, there's a tax that's paid, and the waste operators, so people like Veolia and Biffa, who you'll know, they basically pay slightly less tax if they give away a bunch of the money from that sort of tax to charitable causes. So it's a small benefit to them. I think they save about 5 or 10% on their tax bill, and then the money then goes to all sorts of good causes, including community buildings is a main thing in those tax credits. So you won't get them almost certainly just for doing something to the heating in your church that's only ever used for church services. But if you have a church building or a church hall that's used widely by your local community, and you know your boiler's on the verge of extinction, and you need some insulation works and some upgrading, and it'll make it more comfortable, and you're going to change your heating system, you may well be able to get some of the landfill tax credits funding. And local people like your local Council for Voluntary Service, CVS, will be able to advise you probably where which ones are applicable in your area. And there's also a website, and I think googling landfill tax credit schemes will get you there, where you can put your postcode in and it will show you which ones you might be eligible for. Education projects, so if you do something very much education focused, that might also attract some funding from corporates. It's worth approaching smaller local businesses for raffles or auction prizes if you're doing events. And where you're doing that kind of small local business thing, wherever it's possible, don't write to them, just always go in person. Or if you can't go in person, then phone them. You'll just get a much better response. Not because you're sort of like some high pressure salesman, but just because people appreciate someone who made the effort to actually go in and talk to them. So that's nothing else to say about corporate support. We'll move on. Public sector funding. At the moment, there isn't much. If you want a guide, the link will be in the version of the slides that gets sent out afterwards. But Ofgem, the electricity generation people, have a helpful guide to public sector funding for sort of energy projects. The other people that are worth speaking to are your local council. So your local, that's either a unitary authority if you're in such an area, or your district council generally, or your LEP, the local enterprise partnership, who often deal with business types of grants and stuff, but are so they're worth talking to. When you're talking to those people or visiting their websites, make sure you sort of tick all the mailing lists, and you'll get lots of stuff that's not relevant. I'm sorry about that, but it does mean that you'll be likely to get stuff whenever there is actually some sort of grant stuff announced that might be relevant to you. You will hear about it. Particularly watch for announcements on Clean Heat Grants 2022. Nobody's quite sure what they're going to include. Will it just be for residential houses? Will it include businesses? Will it include charities? Nobody knows. How much money will it be worth? What will it be for? All these questions are unknown. But the rumour is it will apply to both households and businesses, and therefore probably include charities and churches. And that it will be several £1,000s towards heat pump and biomass type heating solutions. That's what people think is going to happen, possibly in the autumn statement, which I think is middle of November, but again, maybe before or after that. So not much at the moment, but kind of watch this space, keep an eye out. When you're applying for public sector funding, most of the same advice applies as for trusts and foundations, which we're going to move on to now very quickly. Lottery funding is basically a form of trust and foundation funding. Some people have ethical questions about this, so just make sure you're all agreed that you're okay with lottery funding. Look at the programme. So the two big ones, which are the National Lottery Communities Fund and the Heritage Fund, actually go, what are they funding? And look for a good fit. So don't just go, oh, we're not excluded from this. We can technically apply. If that's all you are, you probably won't get anything. So make sure that you're a good fit for whatever it is that they're funding. Smaller amounts are always less competitive, so you're much more likely to get £15,000 than you are to get £30,000, and much more than twice as likely to get £15,000 than £30,000. So, it's worth thinking about. If we've got a very big project, could this project actually be phased over 5 or 6 years? So we can go once for this bit of it here, and then in 3 years' time, we can go back for this bit of it here. Because again, you're much more likely to get 2 lots of £15,000 5 years apart than 1 lot of £30,000. Both the main lottery funds, communities and heritage, are all about people and community. So even with the Heritage Fund, the main objective isn't preserving heritage buildings, it's actually people engaging with heritage. So think about that when you're working out what you're going to apply for. And both of the lottery funds, my experience with them are absolutely brilliant, really great people, really keen to kind of give their money out. Like, they absolutely wanted to do great stuff. They're great communicators, so ring them up and talk to them because they will be really helpful. Trusts and foundations. A couple of things here. First one, trusts and foundations, people often ask, well, how do I find out where I go to apply? And there's a bunch of research you can do. We've got a guide. We're going to send it to you all after this. Your local council for voluntary service will almost certainly know the local trust funders and will be able to help you. Your community foundations, a community foundation for every historic county in England. So speak to your community foundation, they may be able to help. There's a bunch of online sites, 2 of which are really great and free, Charity Excellence and My Funding Central. Again, links will be in the PowerPoint here. And then Funds Online, which you pay for, but which is also absolutely brilliant. The other great tip that I always use whenever I'm doing this kind of research is find other churches that have done a similar project, and often they will list who funded them. And if they fund that, they may well fund you. Other charities in your very local area. So that will help you find local trusts, because if 5 different charities in your local area are funded by X trust, again, may well be willing to fund you. And then once you've found names, if you want to know stuff like how big is this charity, what kind of things does it fund, do I know any of the trustees, Charity Commission website is absolutely great for that. When you found a trust that you think you might want to apply to, 6 things you should check. Will they fund your charitable status? So most will fund, almost all trusts will fund registered charities. Most will fund exempt charities, which is what quite a lot of Anglican churches are, but you need to check. Do they fund in your geographical area? Again, lots of trusts have geographical restrictions. Will they fund your charity or cause type? So there are some trusts and foundations, we said this last time, that just don't fund churches. There are many others that will fund churches, but not their religious activities. So worth checking that. Do they offer the right type of funding? Lots of churches, lots of trusts and foundations will fund capital projects. Many will fund revenue projects, so that's the spending on salaries and those kind of things, and a small number will fund they'll just give you money to just do what you do. So you need to check the funding type matches what you want. Check the size. Again, lots of trusts and foundations won't give to charities over a certain annual revenue, so check that you're okay. Most churches are. And finally, check the proportion of funds raised. So, for example, if you want to apply to the Garfield Weston Foundation, which is a very big one, they like you to have got 50% of the funds already raised before you make your application to them. And they would say they rarely give more than 10% of the project cost. So you need to factor that in and work out how much do I realistically think we might get from these folk. And finally, final slide, how to structure your application to a trust or foundation. Please, 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 please do what they ask. I sit on some of these foundations, the number of people who just, you make some very clear things about what people should do and they just completely ignore them and send you what they wanted to. Those people are not going to get a grant because I'm not willing to trust that they'll then spend the money how they said they will if they can't even follow very clear and simple requests about what they should submit in the first place. Many small trusts and foundations don't ask, particularly for, don't tell you how to make your application. So keep it succinct, one side covering letter, introducing the project, and signed by somebody appropriate, usually chair of your PCC or a church warden. 3-side application, so that should set out all of your kind of, all the things in the case for support that we've just talked about. And then as appendices or additional things, include your annual report and accounts, unless they ask you not to. And so many do ask you not to now because they can get them from the Charity Commission usually. A couple of pictures if that's appropriate to the project, and any other relevant material, but don't overwhelm them with loads and loads of bump because it won't get read. And then if it's a postal application, again, many of the smaller trusts are still using postal applications. I would always include a stamped addressed envelope because it makes you much more likely to get if you're going to get a no, you're more likely, if you include an essay, to know that you've had a no, and then you can kind of cross them off your list and stop worrying about them. And I am done, and we have 3 minutes of questions.
Right. We're going to have to be very short answers. Thank you. I've made so many notes during that. It was very useful. Charles's question, is it useful to have a patron who gives their name to a project?
I think it's great to have a patron who gives their name to a project, but I wouldn't have a patron who doesn't give money. So I think if you've got somebody who you think would be a really great patron, they will be a much better patron if they can talk to other potential donors and say, I believe in this and I've given to it too.
From Claire, what makes something a restricted donation? Is it how the written or spoken message is phrased?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Claire. So basically, if there's a leaflet that says, if you give to this, we will spend it on this, then if somebody then, responds to that leaflet and gives to that, then you have to suspend it on the thing you said. Obviously, if it's spoken, it's a little bit more ambiguous, but I would try and be as clear as I can when you're sort of asking for donations verbally that, could you give us some money? Our intention is to use it for, improving the heating system. We think that'll be through a heat pump, but, we recognize that it might not be, whatever. So it's just about trying to help people understand that, if they give the donation, you will do your best to spend it on the project that you have in mind. But if you need to change that, then they've given the donation more generally to the church to spend as is best.
And I've seen ones where they have maybe a footnote that says, by this date, any unspent money will then be moved over to, general.
Yeah, that's another good thing that you can do to kind of make it easier.
The next question from Kate is about sort of shared partnership projects. So the church is part of the local community. The local community is working on environmental projects. Is it easy to get funding for shared projects?
I think the answer is funders love shared projects because charities are rubbish at cooperating. So actually, if you can get a really great shared project together, then you have a much better chance of getting funded for it than you might do if either of the two bodies did it on their own. The hard part is just inevitably the collaboration with other organizations, not because either of you are kind of bad people, but just because working with other people makes life more complicated. But it's a great idea, and if you can do it, then definitely do, Kate.
You'll need a lead charity to put in the application, I assume.
So somebody will have to put in the app, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the same charity for every application. So you can split it up between you perhaps, and sometimes that can help with the workload as well.
Yeah. We've got a partnership project that we're working on at the moment with a secular organisation, a biodiversity project, and that's quite useful actually, because then there are some funders that we're eligible to apply to that they're not, and vice versa. The next question, it's kind of in a way out of the scope of this webinar, so you might want to just say it's out of the scope of this webinar, but it's about whether small rural churches should combine activities with a neighbouring church rather than trying to sort of raise money for their own.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I totally understand why you asked that anonymously, because I know it can be a very painful discussion to have in churches. And I think the answer is definitely, in some cases, yes, it probably would be better, because you may well be able to create one really viable church that can be, you know, environmentally friendly and also thriving, rather than 3 struggling churches. But I know it's easy to say that in a webinar and really hard to do it in real life. So you totally have my sympathy, but absolutely that should always be on the table. And, you know, well done to you if you're the person who's raising that question in your own setting.
And finally, what an interesting question. How do we think about fundraising for a relatively small but well-defined project when the church might be asking for £1 million for a big building project in a year or 2? That's about approaching different funders, I assume, ones who are interested in that small project.
Yes, so I think definitely, but also about so particularly trusts and foundations, read the criteria. So there are quite a lot of trusts and foundations where they will very happily give you, you know, an amount of money for a small project now, and you can reapply for a bigger project in sometimes 1, 2 or 3 years time, sometimes as long as 5 years. So depending on what your timeline is, you might actually be better getting some money out of them for a small project now and then going back in 3 years time, because they'll know who you are. They'll have seen that you did a really great job with the project that you had and that you met all the outcomes that you said you were going to meet, and you will be familiar to them, and therefore actually that might help your chances of getting the bigger amount later on. So just like be thoughtful, read the criteria, make sure you kind of follow what they say, and have that conversation within the church intelligently, and sort of say, you know, we're not going to do anything that kind of jeopardizes our future project, but here are 10 foundations we think we could apply to that either wouldn't fund that bigger project or that actually potentially would fund both.
Thank you. That's all the questions that are there. Thank you so much, Andrew, for the very practical wisdom that you have brought to bear for the last hour and a half. It's been so clear that you know what you are talking about and have a lot of lived experience of raising money for churches. So thank you so much. To everyone that's joined us, thank you very much for coming. I will send you later today an email with the slides, with the link through to the recordings and the links from the chat, and a copy of our grants directory, which lists all of the environmental funders that we are aware of that work at a national level. There'll probably be other local ones, but you'll need to research those yourselves. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you at one of our future webinars.
Thank you, everybody.
Save the chat and end.